So they kind of found their own way to it and argued their way into it. They crowded into the semantics of these concepts and made them their own. And were quite successful doing exactly that. So there would be many treaties on true social policy, which would be impartial, no, for all. It's always the idea that you need to stay away as much as possible. And if you do something via tariffs, maybe, or via minimum wage, working hours, working conditions, then this needs to be for everybody. And that would be okay. That would be truly social. If you just go in and are arbitrary, then you're on the way to hell. It was very much value-based, very much value-based. They would always come up with these discussions. Whereas these days, I would say it's more assumption-based, that you can find it in the concept of reform. I mean, I grew up, or I still think, let's say, reform was such a progressive project. Reform was positive. Like, yeah, let's reform society. Now, when I hear the word reform, I'm like, oh no, not another reform. It will probably mean whatever, something neoliberal, something bad, something that we need to save, or some tax that is not taken, or something that is cut in order to be more efficient. So please write the history of the concept of reform. We need that, and I think we can explain a lot through such a history. It's more assumption-based, as I said, assuming that if we only let markets unfold correctly, then we will get the good results. That is precisely the argument of the macroeconomic theories that was developed ever since the 1930s. Neoliberalism is very much, when you compare it to Keynesianism or others, it focuses on the mistakes of the boom. So when there is a crisis, they always have an easy time saying, well, it was because of past mistakes. It's because we didn't steer the boom in the right way. That's why we need to reform and be even more radical. Because they have a very different business cycle analysis than the Keynesian, which focuses on the bust, moves in and tries to shorten the period of time of crisis. So Keynesianism and neoliberalism, two very distinct theories of business cycle analysis, macroeconomics. They were also very critical of laissez-faire at the time. And now I think we are seeing a return of laissez-faire. Ironically, with the return of nationalism, which is kind of bizarre. There used to be a saying, we should have no laissez-faire in the 50s and 40s, these neoliberals would say, but we should have laissez-passer. There was a dream of an international world, laissez-passer, so everybody, people, services, commodities, they should be, passed through, but in a regulated manner, not in a laissez-faire manner. Now it seems to be exactly the other way around, that we should not have laissez-passer. We all remember what Donald Trump said, and we all remember possibly other examples of a national, but very, very liberal economy. So we have a very strange thing of nationalist, laissez-faire neoliberalism these days. Some of my colleagues call it folk neoliberalism. That's a new kind of variation that we see today. Yeah, I mean, I could go on, but I fear that my time is moving up. Just to contextualize a little bit and to illustrate for you the history of these stories. There's the war. All of the early neoliberals were actually soldiers in the war. They've been there in the First World War, and they also went, some of them even in the Second. They lost their sons in the Second World War. They've seen it. They've lived through crisis. It's not that they're just, grumpy old men sitting in offices. And that's something that's driving them. Also, the Lippmann Colloquium in 1938, it was held in August 1938. It was held with war, in the back of their mind. So when they were discussing, they were always discussing a post-war peaceful global order. This in their defense at the time, but we must understand that this is their motivation. And they're also right against communism and fascism. They're very strong contenders at the time. So they come up with a very strong ideology in order to get their, to fight these variations of ideologies. There were topics at the time around which neoliberalism emerged as an ideology. Most of the topics are on national sovereignty and when to stop it. So pure 100% national sovereignty, no, because we need federalism. That would be wrong. If we have only politics going in circles, 100% nation, that's bad. That's bad for peace. It's bad for international dialogue. We cannot avoid the nation state. We agree it must exist, but it needs to be shaped in a certain way. That would be the neoliberal answer. Where to limit sovereignty? When does national sovereignty turn into nationalism and into something dangerous? These kind of questions were there. Colonies and empire play a huge role. How do we provide the raw materials? How do we gain access to other markets? All of this was in their global imagination a very strong. The minority question. How do we, if we have a federal state, who lives in those states? How do we deal with the minorities? What about language representation, ethnicities? All of these questions were on their minds. No? So it's not just economy. They address all of the questions of their time. And one of the answers, they converse with international law, they converse with sociologists, historians, politicians, and then they come up with their ideas as a solution. And also, I put here, this is kind of, maybe a bit confusing at the same time. And collective security, regional federalism, and economic integration were terms that came up at the time and were heavily discussed and towards which neoliberals contributed. And there were a number of other institutions that were very important at the time within which neoliberals met and conversed. I don't know whether you know any of them. The Pan-European Movement, the Federal Union, which was a very strong organization with Lord Beveridge, heavily funded by the British government and the French government, preparing a post-war global world federation. That was their idea. The Bank for International Settlements, founded in the 30s, still around. It's like the Bank for Central Banks, a very important, powerful ruler, general manager, one of our neoliberals already in the 30s. So you can find them everywhere. Whichever institution you look at, you find a neoliberal if you follow that trail rather than the Mont Pelerin trail. They were everywhere. Writing the Rome treaties in the 1950s, we have Rueff and Magellan. We have the Germans who also wrote those treaties. We have them at the OECD. We have them in the World Bank and the IMF. So Jacques Rueff, one of the most famous early neoliberals, was a judge at the European Court. So they are part of an elite policy circle already in the 40s and 50s. So this needs to be taken into account. So they are part of a policy world which, when it ran into the crisis of the 1970s, was solved within those circles. This is just also to give you an illustration of how thematically it developed over the 20s and 30s, when hundreds and hundreds of intellectuals and policymakers would meet on exactly those topics, and they would discuss exactly the very policy ideas of how much intervention, which kind of intervention, what philosophy of intervention, how do we get social peace, how do we avoid hierarchical societies, how do we avoid poverty in society so that we can have and all these questions were there. Debate, it's very fascinating, debating with fascists and communists and everything, which is where neoliberalism shaped. Okay. Yeah, this would be even more detailed. Just, I hope you can believe me, I have all the files. They were not just Mont Pelerinians, but this is to illustrate a group of people that came together at the Lippmann Colloquium and show where else they've been. They've been global experts, right? Yeah, okay. I'm happy to share this. The agenda of liberalism would allow for, these are the 5 points that they came up with. But maybe here's a quote to come to an end. But just the 5 points. What is the agenda of liberalism? First of all, you need to have the price mechanism, right? And this is something that was very much debated. The price mechanism, but where? In all of the economy, including the chemical industry, including all banks, including communication, or only in parts of the economy? Which parts of the economy should be, dominated by the price mechanism, and where should we not have it? That was a totally normal discussion at the time. And it's probably a discussion we should have much more today, which we are actually having when I look at the discussion now concerned with the energy crisis and the Russian-Ukrainian war. There is actually an energy gas price cap that is introduced, so it is possible to open up that scope, which I was talking about again, and talk about these things. Here's a quote from Karl Joachim Friedrich, one of the many émigré scholars. This is from 1955, again to show you how developed neoliberalism at the time was, and that it existed as an agenda. With all their shortcomings, or maybe even start before, neoliberalism is ready to undertake a fresh start in fulfilling the basic task of Western politics. And that's something that unites them deeply, that Western, Occidental heritage, again, something that I guess today needs to be heavily discussed. Discussing and defining the proper limits between government and society. With all their shortcomings, the European neoliberals are resuming the never-ending task of balancing social justice and freedom, communal man and individual man, reason and will. So they knew, okay, this is about negotiation. This is not about market for everybody, and that's, our own individual interest and desire will create a good society just by doing that. They were not into that, and so that scope, I guess, needs to be regained. At least this is part of the lessons that I learned from all of these years that I spent with neoliberals. They were born in and remained resilient within those transnational expert institutions, particularly the Geneva Graduate Institute for International Studies, where I spent the last week, full of them, still is. It's a complex setting of think tanks, foundations, policymaking, and research institutions. It survived in the 70s. Because of this structural fact, it just took a new semantic form afterwards in the 80s and 90s, the form we are more, I think, familiar with. It was nonpartisan. It included social democrats. Not many, but some, and social liberals. The political struggle was about the common good and how best to achieve it, and that is something, I guess, that is happening again, or should happen again today. So I was able to get, what did I learn from it? I am now doing the next project, which is called Global Governance Beyond Neoliberalism, where we try with colleagues to maybe do a little bit like they did, or do a little bit like the Mont Pelerinians do. So we're the experts, let's talk, let's come up with alternative ideas, and not just talk to ourselves where we all agree, but go and battle it out with policymakers, have meetings with people who work at the European Commission, have meetings with the members of the OECD, and communicate different ideas. One of the two examples I'd like to give. One is the gas cap. My colleague and good friend, no, not good friend, yeah, she's a good friend, yeah, Isabella Weber, she's very busy. She was able as a scholar to move in and to propose this gas cap and say, hey guys, I actually calculated it, it works, and so now it's become policy. Other big movement, we had it in Germany, particularly in my hometown, where it was about big housing, the housing inequality, housing prices going through the roof. What can you do against that? How can you make sure that people have a decent living when housing is a human right? Then there was this movement of expropriation, that you try to expropriate the monopolists. Actually, that's a pretty neoliberal thing to do. There's a monopoly in owning real estate, let's cut it down. And the German constitution gives you the possibility to expropriate. It's kind of wild, but you can do that. It's constitutionally possible. So, they get this is the discussion that I mean when I say talk about the common good. So there's lots to do, I guess, particularly that we have a global world in which we need to do it, thinking of diversity, thinking of indigenous knowledge, thinking of global inequalities, and so on and so forth. So I'll be busy, and I guess you'll too. Thanks for listening. I'm sorry it took so long.
Thank you very much. And as you can see, I'm not Ola Inseth. My name is Ingrid Wergeland, and I'm taking over this interviewing part for Ola, who could not participate. Okay, thank you very much for your speech, and I'll follow up with some of the things you said. because you're focusing a lot on these international institutions as home of the neoliberalism. And that way we move away from the nation states and the politicians and the political scenes that we have in the separate countries. Does that make it easier or harder to oppose to neoliberalism?
Yeah, well, good question. I think it's always, you know, it's the same thing. I think we should do wherever we can. It makes it maybe a bit more difficult, but at the same time, I believe that just to recognize the fact that there are transnational elites, that there are transnational spaces where political language is shaped, certain ideas are shaped, we just need to move in there as well, you know. It's just as important, I guess, to fight local, even in urban context, not even on the national level, but smaller level, local battles for, I took the example of housing, for education, for all sorts of reasons, minimum wages. So just be aware. I guess it makes it more complex, though. So that would be my answer. It's not easy. It makes it more complex. Yeah.
You have taken us through 100 years of neoliberalism here. So, and as you said, you know their thoughts maybe better than many of us here. And I really try to understand the way the neoliberals think, because for me, as not being neoliberalist myself, I find it hard to understand their concept of freedom, because the way I see it, they really reduce, or they want to reduce democracy, as I see it.
Yeah.
And how can you have freedom if you don't have democracy? I'm not in their point of view.
Yeah, okay.
Please elaborate. It's easier to understand your anime.
That's always a difficult position to be in, that I'm kind of reading the minds of them, of those, you know, which I don't agree with them. But what would they say? Well, they were very wary of democracy. They didn't like it that well. They only, because they had a certain conception of the mass. So, you know, mass societies, that's bad. Why? Why are mass societies bad in the mind of neoliberalism? And why are they actually not democratic in the minds of neoliberalism? That would be because masses can be emotionalized, masses can be whipped up into some kind of frenzy, and then they can turn societies into populist systems, autocracies. So kind of an old conservative argument from Ortega y Gasset and others from the mid-20s, 30s, and a kind of, that was how democracy was seen at the time, which is why the only democracy they could come to terms with would be a representative democracy. So that this kind of democracy, that you give your mandate sort of to somebody else, and you know, you live your free life. And democracy was understood maybe more in the Republican spirit by them, that any law that I am bound to, I was the co-author of. It's one of the fundamental ideas of you know, Enlightenment republicanism, that through a public sphere, I, as a moral individual, must be part of the laws to which I must obey. So that is something they all believed in, and this is how far they would go. As soon as democracy would be too strict and too massy, they didn't like it. Now, coming to freedom and where the role of freedom is, they didn't understand it as having a say every time around, but they would not define it. And freedom would be something that is left open. So as soon as you start to rush in and define freedom, turn it into a positive concept, then you're on the way downhill. Just like there was a lot of debate on the concept of human dignity. If you define what human dignity is, well, then you also know what it is not. And you can easily come up with a legitimacy for waging war because somebody was supposedly, you know, acting against this idea. So they didn't like the idea of defining freedom. That should be something that you do. It's kind of a chaotic agreement. You know, you and I, we like certain things, we follow our desires, and we're free to do that in whichever way we should be. There shouldn't be an obstacle. Too many decisions made that would be creating obstacles in the minds of neoliberals.
Maybe this is about the same theme, but you were talking about the distribution of power, and we know how much they disliked unions and crushed unions.
Good point.
Thatcher and Reagan who follow these ideas. How can we distribute power without unions?
Okay, now I again sound like a defender of
neoliberal. But we need to try to understand them.
Definitely. I cannot
argue against.
No, but you see, okay, let's go back to history. When the Lippmann Colloquium was held in '38, it was in August, they decided that was a great meeting. We need to have a new institute. So there was supposed to be a new institute for the international study of liberal societies in Paris. And they had a meeting, the very first meeting, where they conveyed their ideas to a group of invited guests, and they were members of the union. The very first conference that neoliberals had was a conference with unions. So what's going on there? And they were giving them the argument, don't follow the false promises of communists. That's just, that's like you're drunk and you're on a nice trip, but then you wake up with a big headache. Right? So you need to be, you need to plan this in the right way. We are the right guys. They didn't mind unions to that degree as they were not monopolies. It goes back to the argument of monopoly. When unions become too strong, neoliberals would come up with the argument, you're monopolizing power. You're just one big union. You need to be more. You need to be cut. That's the argument.
We had a meeting earlier today in the opening of the conference where both Norwegian and Swedish authors said that today nobody would call themselves neoliberals.
Yes.
Neoliberalists. Do you share their view?
As a matter of fact, yes, I do. I mean, I have the same typology and I had the same observation. But as I kind of witnessed over the last years, there's an increasing number of more positive self-descriptions of neoliberalism. There's a think tank in Germany, the Kronberger Kreis, which would say, we're the real neoliberals, and they would make reference to the early ordo-liberals in a more positive way. The German president even said it in a speech, that neoliberalism back then wasn't so bad. So it's coming back a little bit, but in general, I would say it's a critical concept. Nobody's walking around saying I'm a neoliberal unless he wants to provoke, or she. Yeah. So I would definitely mostly agree. Yeah.
Now we have had years with COVID, and now with the energy crisis. The state is definitively back as an economic actor. How do all those neoliberalists who don't get out as neoliberalists, how do they treat this fact?
Yeah. Well, you see, in the end, they do it, and they come up with arguments why it's still okay. Again, allow me to give the example of Germany, which has this kind of interesting government with a very liberal finance minister, a social democratic chancellor who's, like social democracy these days is, and kind of, pro-neoliberal or pro-market with a bit of a social face. And then the Green Minister of the Economy from the Green Party, who dreams of circular economy and wants to change everything, and he has, big ideas. Totally different, but they need to get to terms. And so they sit together and they make a compromise, good old compromise. The main guy, so here my neoliberals, the main guy behind the Minister of Finance is an economist called Lars Feld, and he's the director and main spokesperson of the Kronberger Kreis, which is the one circle of economists that still calls themselves neoliberals. So we have one of the most high-profile economists as the main consultant of our Minister of Finance. So, but this is the point. They are in the end, neoliberalism is shape-changing. They can adapt. So the argument that the Minister of Finance makes is, no, I don't like this at all. But if we do it, obviously nobody should be, this is again, and the old neoliberal thinking, in the end they have some kind of social, let's say last point. They can't let it happen that people become poor and that all of those poor citizens then, have have a really bad time and are broke, and because this will have ultimately consequences for what? The economy, if we have so many broke people, no, that shouldn't happen, and for the security of society. So these are then legitimacies that they come up with in order to justify a certain policy. And very importantly, there is in the German constitution a law that you're not allowed to make more debt, so that public debt, and they're, to have magical skills with a national budget, so that they have a price cap, but they also don't go into further debt. That's the neoliberal compromise in Germany.
We'll have questions from the audience, if there are anyone who's signing up. Yes, there are.
Yes, please.
Is there anybody with the microphone who could please help us out? And please present yourselves so that we know who's talking. Okay, go ahead.
Hi, my name's Paul Harnett.
Hi.
I'm from the UK. I'm an economist.
Okay, you know everything.
No, I don't know everything, that's for sure. I should probably more accurately call myself a political economist.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks very much for your history of neoliberalism. From an academic point of view, I'm much more interested in following the money, and you alluded to it a couple of times, but I'd love you to expand on how much of the wealthiest people in the world's money has supported neoliberal thinking. And I'm thinking about dark money at the moment. There's an interesting book by Jane Mayer and another interesting book called Democracy in Chains by Nancy MacLean, which basically shows the amount of rich, dark money that has supported neoliberal policies.
Shall we have more questions, or should
I think we'll have more questions and
Take
then
a round?
we'll sum up.
Okay.
I think that's the best way to do it. Just notes.
Sure. I was.
Hello, my name is Helene Bank.
Hi.
Come from Aarhus originally, but I work with the campaign for the welfare state here in Norway. I have a question that can be linked with actually to follow the money, and that is to say that they really hate monopolies. But how do they argue in terms of natural monopolies, those that cannot you cannot just copy a railway line, for example, or the patents, as we have seen now in the COVID, or patent on seeds, and also the monopolization that the very competition creates.
Yes.
So maybe if you could link those two with the following the money. What do they do about it? Because I find that our neoliberal think tank in Norway does not attack that one, for example. I have more questions, but I think that was
okay.
It would be good to have a follow on this one.
All right, I'll try to.
Well, there's one more question, isn't it?
Then I start forgetting. Yeah, okay.
Wasn't it one more here, around here? Yeah, right, thanks.
I'm David Golden, I'm from the US. One of the assumptions of the neoliberals is that market, which I think can be defined sometimes as a budget, leads to excellent products, especially if they're in competition. But we've had some examples with the most recent Boeing 737 MAX, in which they designed an airplane according to budget and dismissed the interests of the people who knew what they were doing in order to compete with the British or the European airplane corporations. And I think that it would be interesting to find out how one can show that actually these neoliberal ideas do create better products, because I don't think they do. I think companies like Toyota, for instance, that try to keep their employees employed, come out with excellent products, and use more like the kind of way of running a company that we used to think are much more likely to be models for going forward. But the Boeing example, I think, is an example of neoliberal politics going right into the production of airplanes, which occasionally Norwegians use to travel around.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, very good points, all of them. Let me try. Let me try to go backwards. Boeing and Airbus and security and ironically, I find if I were to start there, some of the public thinking is much more neoliberal than it is in the big companies. You mentioned Toyota. We could look at Volkswagen. We could look at other big players. They treat their employees in a good way, and in a sustainable manner. You should be able to have a house and everything. Completely inside these big companies, it's all right. Whereas, ironically, in some of the government agencies, people are running on short salaries, short-term contracts, and they're sometimes more neoliberal than the private actors. That's ironic. Sometimes it's true. I don't know what you meant with the Boeing and the production, but I take it you kind of referred to learning by doing, that certain standards are not applied to production schemes. Is that right? And so you start to produce according to budget, and you produce an airplane that doesn't fly. Or you build oil drilling platforms in the Pacific Ocean outside Brazil, according to that model, and then they break down, and you have an environmental disaster. I think there's a different European approach, and I think particularly within GATT and less so in the WTO, which is the successor organization of GATT. We had lots of discussions between those two different approaches. Test and make sure that it works, and have regulations and everything in place before you go into large-scale production of these dangerous and core industries. That would be the European approach versus an American approach. That's true. That's all I could say to that, and I definitely agree that it would be better to have airplanes that fly. Yeah, absolutely. The question on patents and on core monopolies, they would say, at least from the knowledge that I have from the books, that if you can tolerate a monopoly, it's those, the natural monopolies. That would be tolerable. The position on patents changed, actually. It used to be seen as a monopoly, so they thought a patent shouldn't be in the hands of one industry or of one inventor. But then with the whole discussion on intellectual rights, intellectual copyright and patent, they changed their position into thinking that patents are okay. So there's Robert van Horn. He's written a great article on exactly these shifts and how they can manage to have the same kind of argumentative background for a very different policy, which goes to illustrate how flexible they often are. Is that okay? Did I miss a third one?
The other thing was the competition issue, that the more competition and where you have the big companies.
Yes. Yes. Well, to my mind, or if I understand them correctly, those big tech monopolies, for example, that we see today are totally not neoliberal. That would be something that needs to be capped, that needs to be taken into account. The competitive order, they called it, So you need to make sure that there is the possibility for competition. So they wouldn't support that, I guess. The originals, at least. I don't know what they say these days. Follow the money. Obviously, yes. There's a lot of money from rich people in founding think tanks, which is why it's difficult to have progressive think tanks. Often think tanks are, they have lots of millions of money from very rich people who want to make sure that their position is maintained. I'm happy to be founded by one of the few progressive foundations, the Hewlett Foundation in the United States, which actually is particularly saying, or precisely saying, well, we must overcome this neoliberalism, and we study how it works. We see how they manage to maintain a certain position. Also, something I didn't mention, but it's fundamentally important, through law, right? Through setting legal precedences here and there, pushing the boundaries and the scope with court decisions and legal practices. There's a lot of money in the neoliberalism. But most, in their defense, in defense of most of the foundations which are responsible for, let's say, founding neoliberalism, these days it's a bit more difficult and much clearer. But the big foundations, the Rockefeller Foundation, the Ford Foundation, Carnegie Endowment, they sponsored everybody in a certain spectrum. They didn't only sponsor neoliberals. So there's a lot of money going into anybody who tries to answer the big questions. Ironically, you probably know, for example, Karl Polanyi as a political economist, right? You know him. So Polanyi wrote his big book of the Great Transformation on a Rockefeller grant. He had 2 years of money to finish the Great Transformation while he was in the US on a Rockefeller grant. Because he was supposed to be an excellent scholar. He was the brother of a very well-known neoliberal, Michael Polanyi. But this just to illustrate that yes, you can follow that money, the dirty money, but to be fair, many of the big foundations also sponsored various points of view. But if you study what is going on these days, particularly in the United States, but also in some others, I would recommend, there's a website called, what is it? Think Tank Analysis. I can find it. But there is a clear right-wing alliance of think tanks and foundations that's much better organized, ironically, than the progressive think tanks are. And behind many of those think tanks is very clearly, this kind of money that you're talking about. They are very well organized.
Okay, we'll finish our meeting here with my last question, because this is a conference with a lot of activists, but also a few academics. So what can activists learn from academics studying neoliberalism?
Use them, don't learn from them. That will be my answer. For example, like now my colleague Isabella is doing. So, proposing, or, for example, the movement that we had in expropriating big houses, big real estate companies. They used, very smart, cutting-edge Cambridge economists to support them. So they had an idea, they had a clear mission, and they knew, in order to back it up, we need knowledge, we need data, we need somebody. So that would be my answer. Use them, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.